So, I would like to tell you about something that I care about very dearly. It's called the Nyquist frequency, and it's referring to something in computer music. And it is the basis of how we're able to get samples and to record music and sound as we do today with digital systems. So, I'm sure you understand how sound works in principle. It's basically an oscillation through a medium such as air, and our ears are sensitive, so that it can pick up these oscillations and interpret it howsoever the brain chooses. If you want to recreate an audio signal, there's two ways you can do it. First off, through analog means or through digital means. If you want to record audio through analog means, you need to actually find a way to get the physical vibrations that exist in the air, whether it be oscillation of pressure or if you're dealing with another medium with some other thing, and translate that into either a cylinder or a paper or some way of recording the movements over time. And then you could use that medium, it could be a wax cylinder, it could be a vinyl disc, to recreate those vibrations and have it amplified using an amplifying circuit. So that's the analog way of recording and recreating music. The digital method does not use analog methods, and what I mean by that, so with analog methods, there is no quantization. Basically, you have a wave, and whatever pressure is in the air affects directly the position of a needle on a piece of wax or on a recording plate for a vinyl disc. When you're living in the real world, things are infinite. Zooming in, finding more detail. Analog describes a non-interrupted stream of information, and that information would be recorded and recreated at the end of the speaker. That's the analog idea. Beyond that, if you want to convert something to digital information, you need to be able to encode it in a language the computer can understand, and ultimately that is ones and zeros. Let's say you have an 8-bit computer use 8 1 or 0 values, and together they can represent a huge range of numbers. That must be how the audio is recorded. It must be stored as a number in time. So the way that works is a computer takes samples. It's looking at a regular time interval, and it takes a sample of a certain amplitude. It could be like a piezoelectric crystal. When it receives sound energy, it creates electric energy. Interestingly, you can also find piezoelectric crystals in firelighters because the same phenomena can be used in a different way. So what I mean by that, you have a firelighter, you have a piezoelectric crystal, and it has a little hammer in there, and you pull it back, and then it strikes the crystal, and that physical energy is converted into electrical energy by the crystal and its lattice structure. Long story short, really interesting stuff. It creates a spark. That's a fairly intense use of the crystal, but even in a less significant way, you can get those electrical signals and record it. Of course, you would need some type of diaphragm to really amplify the surface area sound would interact with. But ultimately, you'd be creating electrical signals through the piezoelectric crystal, starting from some physical force, that is the movement of air. I think I've spoken long enough about that. Let me move on. So anyway, so if a computer is able to take samples over a given amount of time, then we can replay that using the same time code. That is the same method of recording for time. And it will recreate the frequencies in the same way they were recorded. But here's the problem with sampling though. You're just looking at points in time. Suppose you have a wave, like so, and you get a point here from like the top of the wave, you get a point there from when it's crossing the equilibrium, and then you get a point at the trough of the wave. Now, that's pretty good, right? Because you can recreate that, assuming that pattern repeats. But there's many artifacts that can occur when those points don't line up with the trough and the crest of our wave. The minimum amount of samples you need to recreate a wave is 2. 1 for the crest and 1 for the trough. That gives way to what is known as the Nyquist frequency. So let's say you want to record a wave that oscillates at 22,000 hertz. Now that's the upper range of human hearing. Suppose you want to record something at that frequency, you'll need to have at least 2 points, 2 samples to represent that wave or to recreate that wave. Now that's not to say that your recreation will be that good. In fact, suppose it was only sampling at halfway up to the trough and somewhat to the next trough. So you're not actually getting the top and top, you're getting something closer to the neutral position where it crosses the halfway amplitude point on, let's say, a graphical line. And so that would mean that if you had to recreate the wave using those samples, you'd create a wave of much lower amplitude, not accurately representing the original wave. Ultimately, you're not getting the best quality as you get higher up in frequency. But yeah, that's technically the limit. It's called the Nyquist frequency. Suppose you want to record the squealing of a bat. Now, bats will squeal really high. I think they say they can squeal like upwards of the 100,000 hertz range. I don't know. And so if you wanted to pick up those high-pitched squeaks, you would need to use a sampling rate twice the number of hertz as what you're trying to record. So let's just give a random number. I don't know if this is accurate. Suppose bats squeal at 60,000 hertz. Alright? You'll need to use a sampling rate of at least 120,000. Suppose you want to record an audio file with pretty good clarity for human listeners. By no means can you record under, I would say 44,000 hertz, because the upper range of human hearing is around 22,000 approximately. And so if you want to capture the original fundamentals of everything we hear, could be in music. Usually the fundamentals are around between 100 hertz and 1,000 hertz. Usually most sounds you would play on, let's say your piano, would be somewhere in that range. Some notes, like the real high notes, let's say your piano keyboard, can be upwards of 2,000 hertz for the fundamental frequency. That is the initial oscillation. But in nature, nothing oscillates like a perfect sine wave, and that's maybe something that you may have not learned in school. But in the real world, there's this thing called harmonics, basically imperfection. So let's say you pluck a string right from its center so that all forces are balanced. So yes, it would create somewhat of a sinusoidal wave. But most times what would happen is you'd pluck somewhat from the corner of a string, let's say a guitar string. And so what you end up with is these oscillations that are whole number multiples of the original frequency. So let's say you have a guitar, and so ideally the guitar string moves like this, right? And that would create a certain sound. That would create a sine wave. But most accurately, the guitar wave goes like this, back and forth, also while oscillating. And those are the harmonics. And the reason it bounces back and forth is very similar to what happens when you get a water hose. I don't know if you've tried this. I remember doing this when I was young. You get a water hose and you pull it nice and tight, not to the point where there is no slack in the line, but just so there is no kinks. And you flick the water hose and you watch the wave travel down the length of the water hose. And then when it hits the spigot, that wave returns and it comes back to you. Your average sound, let's say something playing at 500 hertz, will have upwards of 30 harmonics. In fact, there's no limit to how many harmonics it has. The only real limit is our ability to detect them, and I guess the imperfections of the real world. Again, these are all the little wiggly stuff that's happening while the main oscillation is occurring. And that main oscillation is called the fundamental. And all the harmonics would be all the little multiples of that that are also moving. If you're interested in that subject, study the harmonic series. There's a great deal of information you can learn there. In fact, the harmonic series is what's responsible for our understanding of Western music. It's why music all across the world maintains certain ratios between certain notes, even with isolation. All musical cultures contain certain tropes. And so this is not a matter of one culture influencing another. This is a matter of something that inherently sounds good. For example, the 3-2 interval, which describes a perfect fifth that we know in Western music, and it also constitutes what we know as a perfect cadence. At its basis is a 3-2 oscillation. So you have a note oscillating at, let's say 200 hertz, or another note oscillating at 300 hertz. That would be a 3-2 relationship. In other words, it'd be a perfect fifth apart. And in all musical cultures, that ratio of perfect fifth exists in their tuning systems. There's a lot of stuff you can study there. I will tell you that today we no longer use harmonic tuning. We use it in relation to some things, but generally we use a method called well temperament, which it allows us to have flexibility to play in all keys, but it does have some limitations as far as the perfect ratios between notes and etc. Long story short, everything has harmonics, and what I was going to say with that is that suppose you have a fundamental frequency from between 100 hertz and 500 hertz. Could be your voice making noise, like ooh, whatever. But in addition to that, there are also upwards of 30 multiples. So let's say the first multiple would be 2 times the number, and the next multiple would be 3 times the number, 4 times the number, etc., etc., etc. You can kind of see where this is starting to go. After 30 multiples, you're easily up into like 20,000, 40,000 hertz range. So the harmonics of a fairly low note can reach quite high on the hertz spectrum. And so the problem you deal with when you're trying to record with digital sampling is you know you have a maximum frequency range. So what you have to do, you have to limit all frequencies going above that, otherwise you'll end up with artifacts. You have more oscillation for every sample point, creating actually a lower wave because it's missing it by a regular amount, which will ultimately repeat. And in fact, I actually have a picture to describe this. It'll help make it clear what I'm describing, and hopefully it won't be so convoluted. Oh, here we go. If we look at this book here, you'll notice something right here. So notice you have a certain sample rate, but then you have a frequency that's higher than that sample rate. So what ends up happening is you end up with these variations. And so when it's sampled, instead of actually catching correct information, it catches a false wave. So the wave right here is pretty fast. It's like do-do-do-do-do like that. But ends up, because the sampling rate is much slower, it's catching it by a certain interval off every sample. But it eventually repeats. But that periodic waveform creates a much lower frequency. There you go, you can see what's happening here. So, I'm trying to navigate these. You see there's a much higher frequency, but because the sampling rate is this up here, when you apply that sampling rate here, information becomes skewed and ends up creating this unintentional wave. So that's why you can't have frequencies just going upwards of 40,000 hertz for something that only has a sampling rate of, let's say, 44,000, because then you'll end up with these really low frequencies that come up as artifacts, which are not actually in the original recording, but it's just a mistake because of the technology of sampling. I've talked long enough. Hopefully that's been interesting. Yeah. This is off the cuff, by the way. That's probably why my information is all over the place, and I can't even talk straight. I said right and straight at the same time. Just right. That's how my brain is. I'm thinking about two things at once. Scattered. Just like this.